Hey everybody, welcome to episode 106. This episode is with a friend of mine who I've wanted to have on here for quite some time. Dr. Stewart Hilliard has made an impact on so many handlers and trainers' lives throughout all the years he's been doing this. He has made videos, he has written books, he has helped other trainers. He has had such an impact on so many handlers and so many trainers throughout the years. It was important to have him on here, especially now that he's getting back out, sharing knowledge to all of us under the Kology symposium that he does with Forrest Mickey and Michael Ellis. If you haven't attended this or see it being offered, you need to jump on it. I can't recommend Kology enough. Now, in the episode, this was actually a 2-hour episode, and because the first hour was pretty much two friends catching up, going over some of the, what I would call and he calls the OGs of dog trainers and our connections to them and our experiences with them, I kind of cut that out and I'm putting that out as a separate video on YouTube. The podcast is mostly the second hour where we get into the training and go over different things that he shares in Kology and how it relates to detection dogs. So I hope you guys enjoy the episode, and if you are interested and you want to hear about the things that we talked about through the dog training history, that'll be separate on YouTube and on my YouTube channel, and you guys can go find it there. I hope you guys enjoy this episode. Look forward to it. Tell us in the comments whether you liked it. Give us thumbs up. Talk to you guys soon. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of K9s Talking Scents. And
where am I looking? Is that where
you're looking right there? And on this episode, I actually get to sit down with somebody who I've known throughout the years of my career, and I wanted to share a story. But before that, everybody, welcome Dr. Stuart Hilliard. Thank you for coming on.
I'm pleased to be here.
So, funny story. I wanted to start off with this. So, as you know, I was in the Air Force, and back in 1997, I was at Ramstein Air Force Base, and I had a Malinois that would not out. Not for the life of him, which is why they gave him to me. I found a book called Schutzhund, written by you.
Yeah. Well, me and Sue Barwick.
Okay, yes, that's right. Yep. And there was an illustration in there of, instead of a correction and pulling back on the collar, the illustration was pull into the sleeve.
That was state of the art right then. That was sophisticated. Don't pull the pinch collar away.
Yes.
Pull it towards. That was some sophisticated behavioral technology there.
And you even had like a hand-drawn illustration of this.
I did the illustration.
There you go.
Yeah.
I kind of recognized it when I saw the dogs. You're showing the different behavioral fear and aggression and all that stuff. But so I saw that and I read the book cover to cover. And I was like, okay. And they stuck me out on an ammo dump. So it was just me and the dog by ourselves. And this dog would out, if he did out, run around behind you and guard you. So I was like, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stake the dog out on a harness and do the bites myself. Give him a bite, pull it to the collar just enough. He let go. Took me maybe 4 or 5 days at work to get to this point. And then I asked somebody, hey, one of the other handlers came to relieve me one night. Will you take some bites from me and my dog? And he was like, oh, I don't want to take a bite off, Kay. That dog's an asshole. He'll turn around, he's gonna bite me in the ass. I know what's gonna happen even if he lets go. I'm like, I've been working on it. I've done some things. I wanna try this. All right, fine. So I said, I'll back time, but I'll stand next to him so he can't go around behind you. So he felt more comfortable. We do that. Takes a bite. I give him the out command. Pops right off. Sits there, and the guy puts the arm down, and since he puts it like in disbelief, Kay goes right after him again because of the movement of that. But your book at that time made a huge impact on a dog that would not out for all the other trainers that were there. And it inspired me at that time to get into learning way more about it, which then led me down the road to the CTS stuff that you did. So what drove your passion for the knowledge that it obviously took years to accumulate with understanding the psychology, understanding the methodologies?
I was kind of a scholarly kid, right? Like I was a bookish kid who read books and studied, science seriously and stuff like that. But what did it was Helmut Reiser.
Yes.
Because in the early 80s, we were training dogs, but we didn't have a theoretical structure on which to hang our practices. And then in 1983, through a funny sort of a gathering together of different factors, we wound, like, Reiser came in 83 and did 2 or 3 seminars in the United States. And one of them was at our little tiny Schutzhund Club in Colorado, because Jan and Amy Jordheim happened to know people in New York who'd set up a New York seminar. So they wangled Reiser coming out to us. And we had the most unbelievable, it was like, it sounds super trite, but it was a life-changing experience for me, because I was super interested in animal behavior, but had no theoretical structure on which to hang the events I saw in the training field. Mm-hmm. And in a day or two of lecture, Reiser unrolled for us this like wonderful, rich theoretical structure that mixed ethology and learning theory, and it was beautifully expressed and stripped down and simple, and my imagination was absolutely grabbed. And I was not the only one, because we lacked any language really to talk about working dogs at the time. We would talk about a dog, like the only expression I remember is that we would say a dog came out, because we only knew how to work over aggression. That was all we knew how to do, was like angry the dog up, right? And so the first point in its life that the dog went, "Rah!" and whined at an agitator, we would say the dog came out. And I remember like being all excited because my bitch Jenny came out one Wednesday night in the parking lot where we trained, right? That was the kind of language we used to talk about. The dog came out, right? And we just had these kind of random terms, and only a procedural understanding of what we were doing. First you do this, then you do that, etc. And so Reiser shows up with this language mixing aggression, predation, Pavlovian conditioning, all this kind of stuff. And it changed the language of dog training in English overnight. Like all of a sudden, some guy in Seattle was talking roughly, after 3 years of exposure to Reiser, people had been exposed to Reiser. All of a sudden, some guy from Seattle is talking the same language that
Steve
I
White?
am. Yeah, it just absolutely caught everybody. And it changed my career in the sense that I found a way to engage with dogs intellectually, because I had a strong intellectual inclination, but I like putting my hands on dogs, but something was missing, because nobody taught me how to think about working with dogs. Reiser taught us how to think about working with dogs, and changed life for me and so many people. And that's somebody else I talked to recently, because I hadn't had any contact at all with Reiser since literally 1983. And Melanie Uda, to say her name properly, who's teaching a seminar this weekend, contacted Reiser, was so kind as to contact Reiser and say I would like to speak to him, set up a conference with him, and we had a brief conversation. The guy looks fucking great, right? Oh, I know.
Hasn't aged.
He's in his early 70s.
Yeah.
He's wiry, still works dogs, still extremely good at training dogs, competitive, and still has a message to get across. And the message is still concentrated, stripped down, simple, accessible. Like, he's my idol. Like, he's still my fucking hero.
You'll laugh at this then. So 1999, German farm field. I had just finished the DPO school, could speak at just enough German. I go to this seminar being put on by Helmut Reiser and Bart Ballon.
So, you told me about that.
Yes,
yeah. Reiser and Ballon. What a weird mixture.
Yes,
right?
right?
Yeah, totally weird mixture.
And that he was the first one that said conflict on purpose and conflict by accident. Conflict on purpose is to train. Conflict by accident is you fucked up.
Yeah.
And
which is a good example of his language. Like, he's a person with a great talent for communicating important and complicated ideas in short, comprehensible sentences. Like, he's a great communicator.
yes.
Yeah.
And that was, I've never forgot it to this day.
Yeah.
It was illustrated so well by what was happening in the moment. Understood it immediately when he explained it, because I had done it so long myself. In this case, it was for context for people who don't know the story. Was just a young girl was going through teaching the dog to out the sleeve, and they would release the sleeve to her, to the dog, and she would tell the dog to out. Then she would kick the sleeve out to the decoy, and each time she'd do that, Bart would correct the dog. for breaking. And then that's when Helmet, stop. Conflict on purpose, conflict on accident. Right now, we don't kick the sleeve out. You just pick it up and hand it. When you kick it out, you're causing the conflict by accident.
And I can't think of anything, any more of a weird sort of cross-cultural encounter,
right,
than Reiser from a German dog sport background with a heavy kind of, ethological emphasis, and Ballon from a Belgian ring background and a heavy operant emphasis like that. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall for that shit.
And it was really early in Bart's career because I had been traveling to Belgium and I was going to the MVBK clubs, and there was a guy named, I don't know if you know the name, Germain Pauls.
Yeah. Actually, I met Germain.
Yeah.
When he was the secretary for NVBK. And it was kind of funny because I was very interested in pedigrees, and I was very interested in the non-FCI dogs, like the NVBK dogs. So, wow, this guy's the secretary of the NVBK. And he had a super, super interesting dog, interesting on pedigree, that went direct back to Agat, who was the dog that Luc van Steenbrouge was breeding on when he did his first breedings in the Patois, right? This is the dog that he was accessing using the two half brothers, Cartouche and another dog.
Oh,
right?
yeah. That's a name.
And so I go to Pavel's house.
Same.
And I go in his office where he keeps all the pedigrees, and it's like there's just fucking papers everywhere. Right?
Yep.
And I'm like, this is
this is the filing system.
This is the filing system for the NVBK.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. But no, I remember Pavel's very well.
He gave me my first blueberry beer that was over there in Belgium. I would go there probably every couple of months and go hang out at his house, stayed at his house with him and his wife.
I didn't get to know him that well. I just met him one time. He was super nice to me, but I just met him one time.
That's how I got to see Bart for the first time, because at the time he was president, not Bart, but Germain. Or I kept saying that improperly, but Germain.
I can't.
Silent G.
I can't remember how the name is actually.
But he would take me to the clubs. But he was judge. I mean, he explained to me all of how MVBK worked. Bring me there, and Bart was just one of those trainers who was out there, and I think Bart had been performing really well in the trials at the time or whatever. And for the Belgians, the use of electricity was not foreign to them at all. They had zero problem with using all kinds of archaic forms of electricity, to include the collars, tail collars, belly collars, battery cables in the ground, and all that kind of stuff. And obviously, Helmut was the first to admit in Germany that he used it when he won the Bundesliga the first time or the second time. I can't remember the exact story, but he finally came out and said, yeah, I use the e-collar. And there was no bans, but it raised a lot of eyebrows because that was newer technology at the time. This is back before, I think, Initech was just kind of starting, but it was the old school change out the colored tabs and the collars. And then the German Teletex, those thick, with a probe on each side that you could start a car with if you needed to. Yeah. But the two of them, I think, at that time were open about how to implement this level of aversive style training mixed in with the positive style of training, and the goal of helping reduce conflict. And there was a barrier over here for the positive punishment side, and there was the barrier over here for the positive reinforcement side. Now, at the time, Helmut, in my opinion, was definitely clearly balanced on that. And Bart, when I was first watching him, again, I'm talking on a very limited scale, but watching him was on the journey of his negative reinforcement forms of training.
Like the whole knee popo.
Yeah, this is like obviously years before the Dancing Bear story and the whole thing that really blew it up for him. But to see, just to like you said, to be the fly on the wall and see that evolution of dog training, and those two guys, like you said, who would have ever thought? Even at the time, I knew of Bart's name, but he was just a guy that competed. Yeah, weird. I knew Helmut's name.
Weird encounter between those two.
Yeah. So Helmut obviously played that big role on you. When you went into the academia of it, was that kind of that fire that to keep going and learning the whys of?
It was actually for me kind of an alternative to dog training. Like when I went to grad school, the idea was, okay, any involvement I have with dogs in future is going to be a sideline. I'm going to go be a college professor. So it was kind of a surprise to me to get out of grad school and then go right back to dogs. But that was just sort of the way it worked out.
How, obviously it did, but what were your feelings at the time when you were finishing grad school and you had this information that filled in some gaps and maybe, I would say, inspired you to kind of test some of these things out in the working dog world based on the academic research from things like rats and pigeons and so forth?
I don't know. I don't know exactly how to answer that question, except that the stuff that I was reading in the course of studying for my PhD, in many cases, threw a spotlight directly on stuff that I'd seen on training fields. In particular, on stuff that I'd seen done on training fields that didn't work. Stuff that I'd done that did not work. And that's sort of been a little bit my raison d'être, right? My reason for being since then is to apply what's known in laboratories from studies of rats and pigeons and so forth to the practical work that people do in training dogs. And it goes back to Reiser, right? Like Reiser gave me a way to engage with dogs intellectually that was primarily ethological. And then once I went to grad school at the University of Texas at Austin in behavioral neuroscience, was really just studies of learning, it gave me a whole new way to understand what was going on with dogs in training. At that point, I was highly theoretical. I was studying basic problems in conditioning theory and learning theory. But I couldn't help but go, hey, this passage, this reference in this book speaks directly to stuff that I see on training fields.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm up to now. We haven't mentioned it yet, but the current endeavor is something that we call K9ology. So Michael Ellis and Forrest Mickey and I have put together a sort of an effort, a collaboration that we refer to as K9ology, which is an old word, kind of a 19th century word for people who are devoted to the study of the training, the behavior, everything about dogs, their domestication, the archaeology of dogs. Just there's this tradition of, you see these guys in, sepia tone 19th century photographs at dog clubs with their dogs in 1905 or 1915 or whatever. And these guys were people who didn't just want to work with dogs, but they thought deeply about dogs, and they tried to organize their thoughts about dogs along the lines of biological science and psychological science of the day and so forth. And these were what I call K9ologists, and they call themselves K9ologists, right? And so what our modern effort of K9ology is to help people do what we like to do, which is to engage with dogs, not just manually and physically, like the raw pleasure of interacting with a dog through the leash and the reward or the suit if you're wearing it or the bite sleeve or whatever, but also using your mind to explore and organize the methods that you use on the training field according to the indications that emerge from empirical findings in laboratories, right? Like intellectual engagement with the dogs. And so this has always been the way. This is the way Reiser taught me to engage with dogs. It's the reason I'm still interested in dogs after 40 years, right? It's the thing that keeps the interest alive for me. And as I understand it, there are more and more people out there who want to engage in dogs this way.
Yep.
And so we've started K9ology to sort of feed this need, entertain ourselves, and have a good time talking about dogs, trying to make our training better, by everyone's training better, but by understanding what science has to say about the stuff that we do on training fields with dogs.
And just getting done this past week, sitting through it myself, and as we've talked with the history, I've sat in a lot of places and I've heard a lot of lectures and seminars and so forth. And I have to say, hands down, the lectures you gave, I mean, all three of you guys together, but more importantly, the pieces, how you broke them down for us to understand a lot of the, like you said, the physiological, the psychological, the methodological type of things that are used in dogs is not even paralleled. And you organized it in a way that is, to me, so critical for dog trainers, because we hear a lot of things. We regurgitate these common, like the operant conditioning quadrant, and we can express, negative punishment, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and this increases behavior, but when you brought in things like hedonic value and insulation of behaviors and omission cues, all of these things fill in significant gaps.
Well, and it all started about maybe 18 or 24 months ago, maybe more than that, because Ivan Balabanov contacted me. I hadn't spoken to Ivan in a really super long time. And he contacted me the night before, like a city council was supposed to meet in San Francisco, because the local kind of governing board, city council or whatever, was to consider and deliberate upon a ban of electric collars in the county, right? And so Balabanov contacted me and basically said, hey, we need some authorities to get up during, to appear during the session in which public comment is solicited and say shit, right? And I kind of declined to do it, partly because it was just sort of too short a notice, and also because at that time I hadn't really organized my thoughts about the use of aversive control, because the question is bigger than the use of electric collar. The question is on the legitimacy and the practices and the ethics of the use of aversive control in any form, with training, with companion dogs, working dogs, etc. And I just hadn't articulated a position. And so I declined to appear because, I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know what my position is, much less to argue one thing or another. But that, in a way, started Kology, because it induced me to go back to scientific literature on topics like conditioned suppression of responding, positive punishment of responding, avoidance learning, escape conditioning, etc., and to look at the canon, the repository of scientific data on these subjects, and figure out what they had to say about the training of dogs, and help me come to a position on these things. Right?
And you did it, in my opinion, without prejudice or bias. You weren't necessarily going into it with the goal of, I want to prove this side wrong.
That's my effort, is rather than to make a recommendation to people, instead say, without advocating one way or the other, as I understand it, express what the data that exists and the conclusions that exist as a result of empirical research have to say about the use of aversive control as it is applied on dog training fields. And that's really the effort initially.
And I can see it, because when these conversations happen within the dog training community, each side tries to support their position by the data that they gravitate to.
Well, there is, how to put it, there is a faction who refers to their preferred practices as the scientific based, the scientifically driven practices of dog training. And one of the things I like to point out is that there is a science of aversive control. There's a substantial canon of data and literature.
I think you use the term metric shit ton.
Metric shit ton might have been the expression I used to say how much data there was out there, right? About the dynamics, the mechanisms, the consequences, the effects of aversive control applied to animals in laboratories. And so one of the things that I try to do is to redress that, to make it clear that there is a science that indicates the protocols and the paradigms for aversive control, and to try to communicate what is known to practical dog trainers.
Yep. And I know you'd been looking for a way to kind of encompass this methodology of incorporating the appropriate levels of reinforcement and punishers. And I truly feel, and someone, like you said, mentioned it during the week, and I'm going to use two words, it's holistic and ethical.
Yeah, we were trying to, there are a couple of expressions that are used for people who include in their toolbox what's often understood as a aversive control behavior and also a pediative control of behavior. And a couple of terms have already been in currency, have already been used. One of them is balanced, but I'm not really an internet guy. I don't spend much time on the internet following what people are saying, right? But as I understand it, balanced has already taken on a connotation, which may not be useful.
It's a poisoned word now these days, yeah.
And the same might be said of progressive. So in a way, we're sort of in search of a new term that expresses the way some technical authorities for whose work I have the greatest respect and admiration, like Michael Ellis, like Forrest Mickey, like other people, their approach to dogs. And we don't have a good word yet
to me, it's
express
natural dog training. It's natural. It mirrors what nature would express upon the dog.
And in a way, I mean, I'm inclined to say that too, right? Like if you leave out sources of information which are given the animal by aversive consequences, you're not using half the animal's nervous system, right?
Correct, yeah. Half
of the endowment that eons of evolution have given to the animal. But that's kind of like saying that, since human beings are adapted to deal with violence, therefore violence is normal and we shouldn't do anything to suppress it, which I think most of us would disagree with. But maybe one of the most persuasive ways to put it is the way that Ivan Balabanov puts it, which is that, and I find this quite a persuasive argument, that if you do free shaping with a dog in training, and all you do is form and shape the animal's behavior by offering information in the form of when you get a marker saying you've done the right thing and you're going to be rewarded, versus when you either get a marker saying you've done nothing, you've done the wrong thing, or you get no information at all, that's only half the information. That you deprive the animal of a whole different source of information that could be supplied by either aversives or signals that tell the animal about the imminence or the lack of imminence of aversives, right? So the way that Ivan looks at it is that you almost put the animal at a disadvantage when, as Michael Ellis puts it, and I think this is a wonderful metaphor, you play hot and cold with the animal, but you leave out half of it.
Yeah.
You only tell him when he's hot. You never tell him when he's cold.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So there's a couple things I'd like you to share with the viewers and the listeners. Tell us appetitive control and instrumental learning. I think these are two things that don't get covered nearly enough.
Yeah, well, without getting all crazy with it, but the conventional understanding of appetitive control of behavior is the presentation of hedonically appetitive outcomes or stimuli. Hedonically appetitive meaning something that feels good when the animal experiences it, right? And one of the things that we try to get across in our educational events that we're referring to as Kology symposia is that the situation is a little more complicated than that. And just because the outcome that I manipulate, either present to the animal or withhold from the animal, is hedonically appetitive, that doesn't mean that the consequences of, for instance, withholding it from the animal are also hedonically appetitive, right? And I'll just kind of leave it to the viewer to unpack that. It gets super, super interesting.
Sure.
And then where instrumental conditioning is concerned, that's just a sort of a conventional definition of a particular kind of conditioning in which the increase in the strength of a response is a function of the consequence or the outcome that response causes.
Okay.
Right.
Yep.
So the reason that the reason that Edward Thorndike used the expression instrumental conditioning is that in his conception, the response is instrumental in bringing about the outcome. The response is instrumental in causing reinforcement. The response is instrumental in causing punishment, etc.
And that kind of pulls me into the detection dog side of things, because these core aspects, I think, too often get overlooked when it comes to the first fear we talked about the other day when it came to detection dogs was the handler's fear of any information being given. I don't want to do anything. I should let the dog figure it out. And there's significant consequences to the outcomes with the lack of communication. From your point of view, talk about how these lessons that we've learned in communication, signals, and so forth can truly benefit the detection dog community versus
I'll
the fear.
kind of back up. Rather than a statement of advocacy, what I'll say is that substance detection training right now is in the sort of clutches of a dialectic, which is a sort of an ongoing conversation, which is, this sort of goes back to Greek philosophy and rhetoric and so forth. And the idea of a dialectic is a conversation that goes on for a long time, a difference of opinion that goes on for a long time, the value of which is not that it's resolved in favor of one or the other, but that it instructs everybody about the topic at hand, right? So the dialectic going on right now, as I understand it, is between the old traditional kind of ethological view of detection, in which the detector dog is a hunter, right? The detector dog is a domesticated predator which is using olfactory sense, to hunt for a source, a signal, which is a signal for a prey item that it gets to kill, right? And the other tradition that's developed in the last few years, as under the encouragement of the behavior analytic point of view, the operant conditioning, sort of Skinnerian point of view, which is penetrated into dog training through the training of exotic animals over the period of the last 30 years or so, is more a case of the dog as a sort of a calibrated detector, which has been taught detection as an operant task of searching for an occasion setter that tells it that the contingency exists. If you sit now, reinforcement will be offered. But the first thing you got to do is you got to find this signal. You have to find the occasion setter, which is the odor. And the thought about detector dogs behind each of these two approaches is quite different, and the methods are very different, and the moods of the dog that you produce are very different. And I don't necessarily have, I'm not going to come across with a judgment like one is the future and the other is not.
Yeah, we don't
know. But it has a lot to do with the duty cycle, right? So if you have a dog who has to be a detector dog for 8 or 10 hours a day, you might have dropped one approach very usefully. If you have a dog who has to be a detector dog for 15 or 20 minutes a day in brief bouts of signaled intense searching, you might approach it a different way.
I totally agree to that.
And that's kind of open-ended, but I would encourage people to detection will be within the purview of kynology, right? Like right now, we're mostly talking about obedience and bite work and all that kind of stuff. But we will address at some point any important topic in the training of working dogs and companion dogs, and substance detection is for sure one of those. So this is a little bit of a teaser. Like if you want to know more about what I mean by, hey, the detector dog as hunter versus the detector dog as calibrated instrument driven by operant contingencies, come to a kynology event in the future and we'll unpack it for you.
So I'll add one of those components that you brought up. So the omission, when you guys were talking about the quadrants and the common points of view that are shared about withholding things versus punishers, but the withholding itself of the reinforcement.
Yeah, and this isn't an original notion with me. Like Ivan Balabanov is all over the airwaves about this. But basically, the very notions of appetitive control of behavior as defined by using a hedonic appetitive, which is like food or a Kong, basically a stimulus that if the animal has contact with it, it will produce pleasant feelings, right? That doesn't imply that everything that you do in a training context is going to produce pleasant feelings. Because when I withhold food or I withhold a strong positive reinforcer like the opportunity to play with a Kong in a predatory kind of a context, that produces frustration. And there's a canon of scientific literature that illuminates the effects of withholding strong positive reinforcers from animals and produces all kinds of converging evidence saying that the emotional states produced by those kinds of events, the withholding of strong positive reinforcers, are aversives, right? And I think I have a new way of saying it, but the notion isn't new. Right? The notion isn't new.
And you've explained it well. So then that brings me to the main heart of the question in detection, which is depending on the type of discipline, but we'll go with the typical professional disciplines such as narcotics, explosives, things of that, just for this example. Because what is thrown around a ton within the training communities here is in training, you're on a continuous reinforcement schedule. Dog finds odor, you pay it. Find odor, it pay it. Yet, when you're operational, you're told you don't reward until you can confirm. And what we just talked about completely highlights the fact that there's potential fallout from withholding reward in that you're making a clear definition between training and reality.
And I'm not going to make a judgment on that because I'm not qualified, right? Like I don't have the forensic training. I don't have the legal training. I don't have the law enforcement training to have any kind of useful opinion on any of this. But if you said to me that my approach is going to be, I'm going to deploy a trained substance detector dog in a context in which the animal will make indications, and I cannot immediately verify whether the indication is a hit or whether it's a false alarm, and therefore my policy is going to be, we're not going to reinforce that response. If you tell me that's the doctrine, and there's nothing wrong with that doctrine, that's completely reasonable, right? If you tell me that's the doctrine, then what that leads me to is the conclusion that you have to modify your training so that it is compatible with that. And so all that is required is to make your dog insensitive to occasions of non-reward, which is something that's not conventional in dog training, right? Like not rewarding the dog when the dog makes the correct indication is a little bit sacrilegious. Everybody's used to working their detector dog on continuous reinforcement, but there's nothing weird. There's not any unusual demand about teaching your dog that sometimes I'm not going to reward you when you give me a hit. Instead, I will take you away, and you might have to give me another correct detection response in proximity to a target in order for me to reward you. And if you make the dog insensitive to non-reward, or to put it another way, if you make the dog persistent in the face of non-reward, then not being rewarded in the street will not be particularly informative to him.
Yeah, not a big deal.
Right, not a big deal. So basically, if your agency or whatever decides that the thing to do is don't pay dogs on the street unless you can verify, and you can't hardly ever verify, right?
Yep.
Then it indicates real clearly what you do, which is in training, you institute random and variable schedules of reinforcement. You already do that with searching, right?
Yeah.
Because in the normal course of events, your dog kind of never knows how long he's going to have to search to find, and all you have to do is go one step further and institute random reinforcement for the find itself. And I personally have worked dogs down to about reinforcement schedules of like 25% or so, which means that the dog only is reinforced for 1 out of 4 indications. And I had experimental reasons for doing that. And it makes it, you get some strain on the dog's part, right?
Yeah.
But it's practical. You can teach the dogs to do it. And a dog that is accustomed to a reinforcement schedule of 50%, or even 75% or whatever, is not going to think twice, given all the other contextual variables being held constant, is not going to think twice about not being paid on a deployment, right? It's going to be ordinary. I don't always get paid for everything I do, right?
And I think that's the key. You know, you and I have a common friend in Angel Landrow, and we have had deep conversations about this, and I've had it with him and others about, as I've evolved as a detection dog handler and trainer. You know, I started off when it was scratch alert dogs, then the evolution to the passive alert dogs. And there's such the history, like we just talked about, of the constant reinforcement schedule and the training. And as the years have gone by,
people are scared to death to not reinforce
I
their
know.
dogs, right?
They're like, what do I do? So
they look at undesirable behaviors that their dogs have that they picked up as a result of accidental reinforcement.
And that's
or
okay.
Whatever. And that shit is like durable, and they understand that it's durable, and I'm not reinforcing it on a steady basis, and it still occurs, but I'm scared to death to not reinforce my dog for one final response.
Yeah.
Right? Like it'll all come apart if I do that.
Yes. And so it led to lots of conversations within the industry and within circles of my friends and peers I look up to. And you said what I've grown to really apply where I can demonstrate the best, which is a variable contingent of reinforcement, sometimes depending on the situation, sometimes depending on the type of detection dog I'm working. But it's introduced and built and turned into a robust thing in the training aspect. So then later, like you said, when it's reality, the dog's like, this is no different than a training day. Sometimes I'm called back off the hide. I indicated, I get called back to the handler. Sometimes I'm reinforced here. Sometimes I'm marked. I have an announced reward.
And sometimes I have to find it again 2 or 3 more times before I get paid. And I've learned to be persistent. And random reinforcement schedules lead to persistence, and we need persistence in extinction conditions out of our working dog.
And I think the more the detection dog industry gets behind that concept, that variable schedule actually will build a better persistent dog than the constant schedule does.
Or at least get less worried about it.
Yes, it's not such the sky's going to fall, like you said. If
I don't pay my dog one time and he's going to forget what odor
or conversely,
like, or
I paid him the one time on something that was incorrect, and now
that too.
I broke it. Oh my God, what do I do?
Yeah, that too.
And that concept, I hope, continues to grow from conversations like this, where people can hear that we can admit, like, this isn't going to break the dog, but it needs to be done progressively.
I expect it will, because there's more and more of an intersection between the academic world of scientific researchers who actually are called upon, like guys like Nathan Hall at Texas Tech, who runs, like, as far as I'm concerned, one of the crown jewels of detector dog science in the United States. They're in the business of training detector dogs so they can do their science, right? And they apply all kinds of not random contingencies, but they apply all kinds of schedules of random reinforcement or partial reinforcement to detector dogs without incident, right? It works out just fine. And because people from this background, this behavior analytic background, have more and more contact with practitioners like you and other people, it just becomes more and more ordinary. They're like, okay, a dog does it. Animals can be persistent in the face of non-reward with just a little bit of encouragement. And so it's not such a big deal to incorporate it in training. And there are actually some highly desirable features of incorporating it in training.
For sure.
Yeah.
And this leads to another one that I'd like you to talk about, Pavlovian interference, because it is something very common.
We've been at it for a really long time, and that's a huge subject.
Okay, so
that's
I'll just
a huge subject.
I'll make it way smaller for you.
Okay.
Pavlovian interference as it relates to the detector dog's trained final response. Connect that dot for the listener or user.
So when you talk about Pavlovian interference, you're pointing at an issue which I think is pervasive and super, super important in dog training and underappreciated, which is the fact that in any instrumental conditioning procedure where cues are available to tell the animal that reward is imminent, that those cues are conditioned by the reward through Pavlovian conditioning. And what can happen is that the animal's Pavlovian responses to those cues that say, hey,
in this case, cue being odor.
Hey, in this case, in the context of detection, the cue is odor, which predicts reward, that the Pavlovian responses to the cue, to the odor, can conflict with and interfere with the instrumental response requirement. So to unpack all of that, one of the cardinal demands for detector dogs in most agency settings, and most settings I would dare say, is something that in the military is called the final response, and I think in law enforcement it's called an indication, right?
Yeah.
Which is a posture the dog has to assume, a sit or a down or something like that. And the essence of it is that it's going to be passive. The animal isn't going to interact physically with the substrate that the animal is searching, right? And where that comes in is that in order to sit or lie down, an animal has to relax certain muscle groups, like bunch of muscle groups in the hindquarters, etc. If an animal gets a signal that, as in the old days, the animal smells odor and I'm going to fire a Kong in between his ears, and the Kong is going to hit the drawer where the odor is hidden, and it's going to go this way, and this really drivey work dog that's been bred for 15 or 20 or 25 generations for a really, really strong response to movement and the onset of stimuli for predatory behavior, that stimuli that predict that, any signal that predicts, hey, a rabbit is going to come firing in, and then it's going to ricochet off in some crazy direction, and you need to be prepared to pursue and catch that shit. What that is going to do is entrain a Pavlovian response, which involves
The dog to lock up.
tension,
Yep.
right? And which is completely natural and in line with the animal's biology and with the demands of Pavlovian conditioning, with the factors driven by Pavlovian conditioning. And the only problem is it conflicts, like I was going to say, a mofo
Yes.
with the demands of the USPCA or any other certifying agency saying, hey, this dog's got to relax half the muscles in his hindquarters and go into a sit instead, right? And that's one of the fundamental technical problems in detection training. And it's kind of, for me, it's one of the classical examples of what I call Pavlovian interference with an instrumental requirement, and also what I call misbehavior, stealing a term from the title of a 1961 paper in, I think, The American Psychologist, written by Keller and Marion Breland, as a famous account of misbehavior in a raccoon and so forth. And the kind of behavior we're talking about in detector dogs is one of the cleanest and clearest and most vivid examples of that.
Yeah.
And so we haven't gotten into what you do about it,
Yeah.
but to put in another plug for K9ology,
Yep.
what we do in K9ology is we talk a lot about the classic problems in dog training, which are almost always driven by the intrusion of Pavlovian contingencies into instrumental procedures that we use to train dogs, and what the heck you do about it. And my job in K9ology is, because I'm not a dog trainer of any particular note, my job is to talk about the problems, talk about what the findings in scientific laboratories have to say about the problems, and then I turn it over to my colleagues, Michael Ellis and Forrest Mickey, who are very, very talented, experienced dog trainers, to show the contemporary, meaning the up-to-date, cutting-edge solutions to this stuff. So that's just kind of a teaser, like, make a Kynology event, and you'll hear us talking about and demonstrating this stuff. And at some point, we're going to get around to substance detection.
Yeah, and I was going to say, because I sat there going through, this is detection dogs, this is detection dogs, this is like all the different things that you guys shared. And so that's why I want the handlers to understand is that, hey, if your dog locks up because it smelled the odor and you trained it to sit, don't get pissed at it and correct it, because correction may actually make the problem potentially even worse with the conflict of the stress now.
The problem is tension, and typically if you correct a dog, you create more tension.
Yep. So I hope someone get some takeaways on that. Only a couple questions left. This other one's one that comes up frequently. Stimulus control. A common thing shared in detection dog world is if your dog has stimulus control, it'll never false alert. You'll never have a problem. Your issue is you haven't taught your dog stimulus control. In my feelings of the detection dog world, stimulus control, especially in certain detection disciplines, is extremely hard to obtain just due to all the different odor profiles that exist within the mixtures.
Well, stimulus control is a Skinnerian term, right? Like that term is directly from B.F. Skinner, who studied operant responding, which is emitted, which is a buzzword. I won't. It gets kind of complicated. Come to Kology, I'll explain it. But basically, Skinner studied animals in a situation, in a paradigm in which the animals were free to emit responses as they felt like emitting them. The dependent variable was rate of responding or probability of responding. So there was no command that told the rat, hey, press the lever now and you'll get a food pellet, right? Later on, Skinner turned his attention to what happens if you have a rat in a Skinner box and there's a lever the animal can press, and under one condition, when the animal presses the lever, it'll get a food pellet. The contingency is lever press results in food pellet. And in another situation, when the animal presses the lever, there'll be no food pellet. And there is a discriminative stimulus, which can be a tone or a light or whatever, that signals to the animal which contingency is in effect. And Skinner referred to this as stimulus control, as in when the rat has become sufficiently educated so that only in the presence of the light, it presses the lever to get the food. And when the light is off, it absolutely does not press the lever. It has learned the discrimination. In that context, Skinner said that the light had stimulus control of responding, of the contingency between the response and the outcome, right? So that's the sort of orienting, that's where the term comes from. What stimulus control is pervasive throughout dog training because we're always signaling to dogs when contingencies are in place. You do this now, you're going to get reinforced. You do this now, you're not going to get reinforced. You do that now, you get punished, etc. Right? So we're always using discriminative stimuli to signal to dogs when contingencies are in effect. Detector dogs are a particular and super interesting context in which stimulus control assumes dimensions of complexity that it doesn't in other situations, because in most phases of training, we're looking for the cleanest and the most precise and the most narrow stimulus control possible. In other words, if I'm teaching a dog a change of positions on the training field, I want, for a particular sport, I want my voice and my voice only to control responding, not my gestures, not the sight of me. I want to be able to put my dog over there in a stand, go hide in a crowd of people where my dog can't see me, and my commands alone will control which response the dog emits next. Whether he'll go into a down or a stand or whatever. In detection, it's a different ball of wax.
Yeah.
Because in detection, depending on the exact application in detection, there's a mix between flexibility or open-endedness of stimulus control and narrowness of stimulus control. What I mean by that is I can go wrong by teaching a dog to respond only to the heroin that my agency has in its inventories, and have the dog ignore all other heroin. Because the stimulus control is that strong, that specific. I need the dog to generalize to heroin that he has not personally experienced that may have a little bit of an odor signature. At the same time, if he generalizes to some weird chemical that has a signature somewhat like an opiate substance,
Citric acid.
that's a case in which my stimulus control is too weak. So the idea in actual kind of real world detector dog applications is that there is some balance between specificity and generalization which is needed in that particular context. And that is one of the central challenges for practitioners of detector dogs, is achieving the right balance so that the dog does not alert on the wrong stuff, but he is capable of alerting on stuff that smells like the things he's been trained on, but may not be exactly the thing he was trained on.
And that dovetails almost exactly what Dr. Nathan Hall said, which was when I asked him the question, how soon would you show the dog another version of heroin after you showed the first one? He goes, the next day. And I didn't understand that for the longest time until probably the past 5 or 6 years. And because part of our system in the detection dog community is we've been inhibited by what we're allowed to have. Here is your training kit. So like the military has the bomb kit. And it's the same size everywhere you go. It's the same. In the drug world, it's the same thing. The cops are given, whether it's DEA or evidence seized, and they have such a history of training to that particular size and type of substance that history makes the dog really resilient in some cases to telling you it smells like this, but that's not mine. And I don't know if I should tell you or not.
Well, Dr. Hall is a behavior analyst of some stature, right? And so I personally, I don't think, how to put it, I don't know, I'm not acquainted with data. I am not steeped in the data to tell me exactly what is the best way to tune generalization curves. But if Nathan Hall's opinion is that you should start from the beginning, not with one homogeneous odor, but that you should start with a range of odors which represents the target generalization span that you need, then I'd believe him. He's a guy that I would take seriously.
And I don't know if you read the research paper, but then there's also the one on the volume of odor, like how much the substance gave off. And that had a significant impact. The dogs got really good on the training kit sizes. And when they went up by 10 or down by 10, dogs dropped to 6.5% accuracy
and that's
until reinforced to these new levels.
And that's a super well-known effect. Practitioners talk about anecdotal observations of that all the time. And you may be referring to what I would call an empirical result, which is when somebody studied in a laboratory. You're talking about Dr. Hall's work, right? So somebody studied in a laboratory with appropriate controls to replicate an effect that many of us have thought we saw in uncontrolled settings and with controls. So basically the idea is that different amounts of stuff represent generalization problems. They don't necessarily smell like that same thing.
Yeah. And that was the biggest, like you said, the things that we've learned from all that was, change your substance as much as you can within your ability, change the volumes. You can't make the assumption if I trained on this, the dog's going to find it in all its shapes, forms, or fashions. And then the stimulus control aspect, the thing that I always kind of laughed at to myself was people would say, well, if your dog has stimulus control, you won't have a false alert. Trust your dog.
I've never heard anybody use stimulus control in that way.
And in the same token, say don't reward when you deploy your dog. And I was like, how can you say out of the one side of your mouth, if your dog has stimulus control, you don't have to, your dog won't false. You should not have a falsing problem. But then on the other side of the mouth say, well, if your dog alerts on the street, don't reward it until you can confirm. How can we say both things if I believe this,
well,
this removes the argument over here.
There's a forensic conclusion implied in there, which I ain't gonna.
Yeah.
I ain't gonna weigh in on because I don't have the training and the qualifications. But yeah, I understand.
But yeah, no, I think we definitely unpacked a lot of stuff in this episode, and
we certainly did.
Yes, and thank you a ton for coming on
I'm
here.
Delighted to appear here. Thank you for the opportunity.
And I'm telling everybody, seriously, Kology, if you see Kology at any place where it's mostly, I know we plan on doing lots here in Santa Rosa, but I know you guys have pointed around the idea.
We're going to try to branch out and
go
do
out
it
places.
in other venues.
And maybe even online. There's some things you guys are looking at.
There should be a Kology presence online as well.
So check it out. Right now, the spot to go to if they want to. Is there anything? Is it Michael's site? Is there any spot?
just go to the Michael Ellis School site, and
Yep.
any upcoming event will be advertised there. Yeah.
Perfect, because I had a lot of questions come in when we were doing.
Thanks for plugging that.
Oh, of course. No, my pleasure, and we'll do more of that as well. But thank you very much for coming on here and doing this.
Okay.
Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in.
Good morning or whatever.
Yeah, wherever you're at. Yeah,
wherever you're at.
Thank you for tuning in to K9s Talking Scents, where it's okay to be nosy.